Well, thank you so much for joining, everyone. And for those watching later, I really appreciate your interest in the topic of glucose and perimenopause. It will be a short, informative session. And if there are any questions, again, like you see my email at the end, feel free to reach out for any further interest or any inquiries. Before I dive right in, I want to introduce myself. My name is Marie-Luise Huber. I am the head of nutrition at Hello Inside. And as you may notice, I do have an accent. I'm originally from Austria, but I live in beautiful Colorado, and it's, I guess, like in the low 70s right now, no snow, but a beautiful sunny day. So to all my Coloradans who are watching it, I'm happy to be here and happy to be like an Austrian living in the mountains again. But it's not about me, it's about perimenopause and glucose. And many of you know that perimenopause is a topic that is kept quiet, even though 100% of women experience menopause. The symptoms women experience are not always the same, and that makes it a little tricky to understand for women if they are in perimenopause or if they like what stage of life they are in right now. But there are symptoms, and those symptoms are very cumbersome. And we at Hello Inside are addressing that because, again, like women experience those symptoms, but it's not necessary to like suffer from them. Um, so what we are doing at Hello Inside is we use continuous glucose monitoring through all different lifestyle phases or life stages actually to help women experience or like have a better life. And what you see here is actually a lot of like different challenges women experience throughout their life stages. It's not only in perimenopause or like menopause where they experience like very cumbersome symptoms, but it can also be, it starts maybe already like in their puberty or like in the reproductive phase, when they have, for example, like PCOS, or they experience infertility, or also maybe gestational diabetes when they are pregnant. So there are a lot of like different phases in a woman's life where the life is not ideal, not optimum. And again, like we at Hello Inside are addressing that by the help of like a continuous glucose monitor. But before we dive right in, before we dive into the aspect of glucose monitoring, I want to raise the flag or like speak about the importance and the connection between glucose and different life stages. What we see here is that the hormone levels of a woman or of women are changing throughout their life, right? You see, like in the puberty, there in that case, the estrogen level is rising through their fertile years, the maturity, it's like probably the highest level they have. And then during menopause and postmenopause, or during perimenopause and postmenopause, it flattens out again. And if it were that easy, I guess life would be a lot easier and so much more pleasant for many women. But unfortunately, it's not. It's not that linear. It's not like the straight line that I showed earlier, because the hormones are fluctuating. We notice that these like fluctuations happen as like a regular part of life for cycle health, because otherwise we would not be able to menstruate. Those hormones, they need to change. But the way they change is very different. It's very different for every woman. It may be even different between cycles, right? So, but what you see here is that in an ideal scenario, quote unquote ideal scenario, the estrogen levels are pretty, like, as I said, like flat, high levels until probably around the age of like 35, maybe even like 38, whatever. But then they start to change drastically. And it's, again, like it's not this like perfect linear curve that we saw earlier. It's fluctuating. It goes up and down, it goes up and down until after perimenopause they are at like a, I would say, the lowest they have ever been, even before I'm born. And the same is with progesterone, right? Like we need those changes. We need the interaction between estrogen and progesterone for a regular menstrual cycle. But those changes are also not linear. They fluctuate and they are not as intense for many women as they are as the estrogen changes. But nevertheless, it's not, as I said, like linear, not a straight line. And what I also brought in here is testosterone because I'm a big believer that testosterone is like probably an underrated hormone for many women, especially when it comes to like a woman's health. So if we look at that, we do see estrogen like very high, then it changes, like fluctuates very rapidly, higher and lower. The progesterone fluctuations are a little more modest or moderate, and the testosterone levels, they change more or less like in a nice line, if you want to call that. But unfortunately, there is another like caveat to this graph, this visualization, because the hormone levels don't change for every woman at the same time. But before we dive right in there, um, I want to highlight the influence of estrogen on the metabolism. And by highlighting that, you will already understand why glucose and the perimenopause or like generally speaking, like hormonal health, but especially like perimenopausal stage are very much connected. On the one hand, when we look into like estrogen's influence on the metabolism is that the estrogen affects where fat is stored in the body. Um, Mother Nature just helped us with a fat distribution around our hips and around like the buttocks to make sure that we are able to support the healthy growth of a baby. Because if we have like enough support there, the body is able to support the growth of a baby. Then also estrogen is increases the metabolic rate by increasing the body's energy expenditure, right? So we noticed that maybe that when we eat something in our, let's say like early or like, yeah, early 20s or like when we went to college or we could eat tons of food, but we wouldn't gain any weight. The reason is that because our estrogen levels are pretty high, quote unquote high, and they help support like the energy expenditure, and then also there's a strong connection, as I said, between estrogen and insulin sensitivity. High estrogens level, which also occur typically in the first half of the menstrual cycle, help cells respond better to insulin. This means that during the first half of our cycle, we do better with carbs. I will go deeper into that in a minute. But that's already like a big important factor to understand that estrogen changes, as I said, like earlier, and it decreases during our perimenopausal phase. That also then means, like in a very short conclusion, that our insulin sensitivity changes during perimenopause. And as I said earlier, estrogen is like a big part of our hormonal health, like the cycle health and everything that's related to the perimenopause. But there's also progesterone that should not be ignored. Progesterone is associated with like an increase in appetite and food cravings. And in general, it is quote unquote higher during the second half of the cycle, during the luteal phase. That also then explains why some women may experience higher cravings for like sweets because their progesterone is higher, right? So they have like a higher appetite during the second half of the cycle. But also, unfortunately, progesterone is also connected with like water retention. That explains why you may experience some weight gain during the second half of the cycle. And it also increases body temperature during the luteal phase when you have like the quote unquote regular menstrual cycle. So if you notice that you're feeling hot, a few days before your period starts, the reason is probably progesterone's impact on body temperature. So feeling hot during the second half of the cycle again, like maybe a result of progesterone. And what we do see here is that even though I mentioned earlier, like the hormones change, especially during the perimenopause. And that's why I like to call it like the perimenopause is the reversed puberty. And for those of you who are already in the perimenopausal phase, they may notice that not every day is the same. And when they think back about like their teenage years when they were in the puberty, those mood swings or like the situations when they were not the nicest to their parents, it may be similar right now. And the reason are our hormones. And what I mentioned earlier as well is that the hormone levels are not the same for every woman, right? So it may be that, for example, one woman in that case, Mary, may have like higher estrogen levels as a like base level during their pre-perimenopause, during their fertile years, higher than Julia, but then the levels drop far quicker during their perimenopausal years. That explains why women experience the symptoms they experience during the perimenopause in such a different way, right? Because the hormone levels are not always the same, and not every woman has the same baseline, and not every woman not every body changes in the same pace. But the result is that the estrogen levels at the end are lower than they have been before. And so you see like this trend going down of like the estrogen levels, even though, as I said earlier, the levels are not linear and like they fluctuate a lot. What I would like to do next is the reason why another reason why it's so important to understand that estrogen, progesterone, and also then like testosterone and glucose are very tightly connected. And I like to use this hierarchy as a reference. So in that video, or like in that graph, you see like I call it like a reversed pyramid, where insulin and cortisol, our stress hormones, are the top tier hormones. I sometimes call them even like the bully hormones. When you think of like a class where someone is like always like very loud and like maybe even bullies the other, the teacher will probably, or like in many scenarios, pay a lot of attention towards those high volume, very loud students. And I use that as an example because our body reacts in a similar way. By that, I mean that if insulin is always like super, super loud, it does not really have time or the capacity to look into and listen to what estrogen or progesterone are saying, right? So that's the reason why it is important that we keep our glucose stable, because insulin is that hormone that reduces the glucose levels. By that, it's like when you imagine you eat something, mostly carbs will increase your glucose. The way they will increase it, we will talk in a minute. But if you understand the glucose increases, that food carbs increase your glucose level, and then you need the insulin to lower those glucose levels, you will understand why it's important to balance the insulin levels so that the body will actually be able to listen what estrogen and progesterone or like testosterone are saying, right? So that's the simplest explanation of why it is important to monitor your glucose levels for hormonal health. On the one hand, insulin is a hormone, so it's important, generally speaking, for hormonal health. But then on the other hand, because insulin is such a loud and important hormone, it's very important that you work, or like that you monitor and balance your glucose levels so that the insulin is not always high, not always loud, and so it's easier for the body to manage those other hormones. But it also goes in the opposite direction. I'm sorry. It also goes in the opposite direction, that like if estrogen and progesterone are disbalanced, it makes it even harder for the body then to work on the whole glucose balance, especially because I mentioned earlier, estrogen increases the insulin sensitivity, so it makes it easier to stabilize those glucose levels, whereas like progesterone lowers the insulin sensitivity. So it's like a bi-directional conversation, but the insulin will always have the highest, will always gain the highest attention or the most attention because it helps with the energy storage, but also then general like energy availability in our bodies. So when we look at the healthy glucose metabolism, we do see like just a quick reminder of like maybe your bio lesson has been a while. So when we eat something, as I said, a healthy person eats carbs. The food then turns into glucose, and the pancreas releases insulin. That's, as I mentioned, the hormone that reduces the glucose levels, so the glucose level lower. And the cool thing actually is that we don't need to have like the glucose, like there's always like a certain base level in our blood vessels of like glucose, but everything that's too much will be turned into glycogen. On the one hand, it will be stored in muscles, but then on the other hand, it will be stored as glycogen in the liver, so that in case you're not like constantly eating, you still have the access to energy. So like it can be returned or reverted back to glucose. So that's like the healthy metabolism. You eat something, the glucose level goes up, pancreas insulin releases insulin, it lowers the glucose level again, and then the excess amount will be stored either in the muscles for like immediate availability, or will be stored in the liver as glycogen. But what if the metabolism now is a little disrupted? Um, let's say you have like generally like already like a high glucose level, and the doctor said you may be at risk for like pre-diabetes or even diabetes. That means that even though you eat something, and yes, the body then will be able to turn it into glucose, the pancreas releases too much insulin, because the there's like an the cells are not as responsive to the insulin anymore. And so like it needs to produce more insulin so that the cells are actually able to open up and bring the glucose into the cells. Unfortunately, that too much insulin then causes very high glucose fluctuations, meaning like very high, and then also very high glucose levels, but then also very deep drops. And this like up and down, and like the higher the variability and the higher the changes, we call like a glucose roller coaster, because it goes like up and down and up and down all the time. And unfortunately, the cells eventually become insulin resistant. The cells are still able to take up the glucose and then turn it into glycogen, but they need a lot more insulin, because again, the cells, they're like, okay, you have been here so many times, and there's even more coming and more coming. We are done with it. Like we don't want to like have this interaction anymore. And then they kind of like shut down, and that's unfortunately then what leads to diabetes. So that's another reason why it's important to understand the connection between insulin and glucose, because we all have insulin. It's not only an issue of people with diabetes. We all have insulin, but it's a question of like how much insulin is produced. So that's another hopefully key takeaway for you to understand. So what are the consequences of like those vast glucose fluctuations? On the one hand, I already talked about insulin resistance or diabetes type 2. But unfortunately, as I said earlier, like if you think about like the hormone hierarchy, those big glucose changes can also lead to hormonal dysfunction, but they can also lead to weight gain. Because one thing I have not mentioned yet is that if there's like too much, like there's only a certain amount of glucose that can be stored in the liver. The excess available amount of glucose will be transferred or changed into fat cells. So having like continuous high glucose levels and like overfilling the liver will result in weight gain because the food, like the glucose will be stored as fat cells. And then also another issue of like long-term consequence of glucose, higher glucose variability and high glucose levels is an early onset of aging. There are even studies that show like it increases the risk of wrinkles, for example. And then also there are new studies that show a connection between high glucose levels and Alzheimer's disease. And some doctors even, or some experts even call Alzheimer's disease already as diabetes type 3. And in the short term, and I think that's what's more interesting for many of us, are the short-term effects we experience when those glucose levels are out of balance or when they are like swinging up and down a lot. On the one hand, we notice the cravings. You may notice, or you may have experienced it yourself that, for example, for lunch, I'm not sure where you are in the US right now, but maybe you just had like some bigger portion of carbs or like pasta for lunch and you already feel tired. That may be a result of like high glucose level, a high increase of your glucose levels as a result of the pasta, and then this steep drop of the glucose levels because of the released insulin. So and then the natural reaction of your body is it asks for more food because food is the quickest and easiest access to actually get more energy back. So short-term consequences are cravings, but also mood swings. We may know these as like hangry symptoms. We had something to eat and then half an hour later, we are hungry again. We also notice bad sleep is a short-term consequence of glucose fluctuations. Fatigue is similar, and skin irritations. So those are the ones that may be noticeable a lot earlier than actually the long-term effects of high glucose levels. I mentioned high glucose levels a lot, but what are those? Generally, it is important to understand the lower the glucose, quote unquote, the better for healthy individuals. So what we did is like we got together with a lot of like experts and advisors in the medical field, and everybody told us that the lower the glucose level, the better it is. And ideally, the glucose levels are between 80 and 110 milligram per deciliter if you're not working out and if you're not working out and like just on a baseline level. So everything above 110 and the higher it is, the worse it gets. Imagine it being like in that case, you really see like a spike, like this very small tip. And that's actually then the aspect that will harm our cells, that will then result in, as I said, like all the long-term consequences. So generally, we want to be within that range. During the night, we want to be a little lower than we are during the day. And the reason for that is that our body's main task overnight when we are sleeping is regeneration and like restorative processes, right? And if our body has to focus too much on high glucose levels, it will not be able to focus on the regeneration and the restorative process. So that's why we generally want a little lower glucose levels during the night. But if you notice like you have like a very bad headache or like something is like bothering you, the levels may be too low. So that's very individual. But as I said, generally we want to be between like 80 and 110. So that's another like ballpark to keep in mind. And when we look right here into the, oops, sorry, we look into the results of like glucose fluctuations. We already mentioned like bad sleep, cravings, weight gain, and then also look into the symptoms somebody may experience as like a perimenopausal symptom. You notice, for example, sleep issues are very often mentioned in women who are in their perimenopausal phase. So you can see that there may be a connection, right? Or the same as for like weight gain, especially around the belly. A lot of women experience weight gain during that phase. And as I said earlier as well, the reason may be um, lower estrogen levels, because estrogen is responsible for the way our fat is stored. But then on the other hand, it may be the result of glucose fluctuations, because insulin then will, if there's too much glucose happening in the body, it will be translated or like transferred into fat cells, and that will be stored, right? So that's another connection between insulin, glucose, estrogen, and the symptoms women during the perimenopausal phase experience. So what do we do at Hello Inside? And for me, it's really important that you have a takeaway or a bunch of takeaways. And so on the one hand, I want you to understand that Hello Inside is one way on how you can assess your health. Glucose is a wonderful tool to understand what is going on in your body, but it's also very important to listen to your cues, to your health. And as I said, like glucose is one way to do that. But I think it's like one of the most potential biomarkers we have available, because it's, you can see like in real time what is going on in your body, right? You don't have to go to the doctor's office to understand like where your glucose level is. You can do it right at home. And we at Hello Insight want to help especially women with the help of a continuous glucose monitor to understand what is going on inside them and make a connection between the symptoms they experience on a daily basis and their glucose levels. So what you can do is, oh, I just realized there's a German slide in there. I'm sorry about that. But it's generally like track your glucose and the symptoms, receive like personalized insights, and monitor your health. So it's a pretty, I would say, comprehensive journey. And as I said earlier, glucose is one parameter of your health. And I think the users we have really confirm that it helps to monitor or improve the perimenopausal symptoms, because as the numbers show, 70% of those who suffered from hot flashes were able to improve these symptoms. 90% of our users in the perimenopausal phase who suffered from food cravings were actually able to reduce them just by monitoring their glucose and understanding what is happening in their body and how their, let's call them lifestyle choices, impact their glucose levels. And then also 53% of women with mood swings noted that they improved. And these are just a few numbers we got back from a survey we did with our users. But I would say they are pretty impressive in terms of how a simple step or a simple trick like monitoring your glucose level can actually improve your quality of life. And as I said earlier, and here's just another quick recap because I know it can be a little confusing. During the first half of the cycle, our estrogen levels are dominant. This supports the insulin sensitivity, it improves energy, and reduces appetite. During the second half of the cycle, the progesterone increases, which means like an increased appetite, water retention, and also reduced insulin sensitivity. And the reason why it's important to make the connection between like the second half of the cycle and the perimenopausal phase is that estrogen is not as dominant anymore. Estrogen is like dropping, and so we're like closer to actually that phase. Again, we may experience increased appetite and also reduced insulin sensitivity. So why should I monitor my blood sugar now during the menopause? As I said, hormonal hierarchy, just a quick reminder here. But it's also important to, on the one hand, overcome cravings, avoid mood swings. Also, we had some women who experienced reduced hot flashes, improved sleep quality. It also can help to maintain or even lose weight, especially because weight loss is a big issue for women in the perimenopausal phase. And it also helps to either get back your energy levels or increase the energy levels again. And as I said earlier already, but here's another slide, blood glucose is one of the most important dynamic biomarker for our health. That's one of the statements Dr. Molly Maloof took. And As I said, it's nutrition is an important aspect, because remember, like the glucose metabolism I mentioned earlier, but it's not the only impacting factor on glucose. There's nutrition, but there's also stress. There's movement. That's why I mentioned earlier that in an ideal scenario, when we do not work out, we want the glucose levels to be between like the range of 80 and 110 milligram, because movement does have an impact on our glucose levels. I will dive into that in a minute. And then also sleep. Glucose, our sleep impacts our glucose levels, and our glucose levels impact our sleep. So there's like this bidirectional relationship. Um, and we can, if we like tweak and twist on one part, we then will put eventually and potentially influence all the other areas of life as well. It's really up to you on like where you want to focus, because again, like each and every part of the lifestyle of those four lifestyle pillars influence our glucose levels. And another important factor is what we have noticed is that calories are not calories. And that's another, especially when talking about like weight gain, a lot of women restrict their calorie intake a lot, because they still have the understanding of like, if you eat too many calories, or like if you eat fewer calories, that will eventually like will automatically lead to weight loss. But unfortunately, that is not the case for multiple reasons. But that's just a good example. What we see right here is that, for example, if you eat a yogurt with 150 calories, your glucose will pretty much remain stable. Versus if you like eat a small piece of like a 150 calorie donut, your glucose levels will be through the roof. So it's really important to understand that calories are not calories, because your body actually, or your glucose knows better. And unfortunately, that's only a slide I do have, or like a screenshot I only have available in German, but it's real-time data from our users. And what I want you to look at right here is the variety of glucose, because all those, it's three women who had the exact same breakfast on a slightly different day, but it really, again, it was like a standardized breakfast. They all ate the same, but the glucose levels were very different. Um, and that's a perfect example of like that the glucose levels are very individual. So on the one hand, keep in mind calories are not calories, but then on the other hand, something that may work for me to stabilize my glucose levels may not work for you. And so it's really important to take a closer look and understand what is going on in your body. As I said earlier as well, nutrition is an important aspect, but it's not the most important one. But what we also can show is that, for example, and that explains why some women say, well, I have had the same breakfast for the last 20 years and everything was fine. And all of a sudden now I gain weight. That's the reason why, because our bodies respond differently to the food we are eating during different life stages. And what you see here is a porridge, as an example, a porridge eaten in your 30s and a porridge eaten in your like early 50s, when the hormonal situation is very different. Again, like I'm right, these are just like example curves, and it's not what it will look like in your body, because the individuality is so high. But generally speaking, that holds true for a lot of women. And so what can you do now to help monitor or help improve your glucose levels? And my favorite tip or glucose trick is actually exercise, or let's call it like movement. It doesn't really have to be exercise, just move your body. Because during exercise, the glucose uptake in the muscles is already increased by about like 50 times. Um, and the cool thing actually about the movement is that you're during movement and also like during any kind of like exercise, your muscle cells open up And the glucose then enters the cell without the help of insulin, right? So you actually protect or save your insulin reserves, and so you will be able like to sustain energy a lot longer, because the body is able to have the energy available, and it doesn't need insulin to lower the glucose level. So that's one of the reasons why walking after a meal is so helpful, because the body doesn't like it just uses the glucose that's available in the system, and doesn't have to go to any of like the storage. So that's why it lowers, quote unquote, almost automatically. But here's another important factor, that depending on what kind of exercise you do, um, depending on that form, your glucose levels will change. On the one hand, as I said, like if you go for a walk or if you do like a moderate bike ride, your glucose levels will either stay the same depending on the intensity, or they may even drop, because the body is just using what's available in the blood. But if you do like, for example, like a high intensity exercise, your glucose levels will increase. That's what you see right here. And the reason for that is that it's still like something from our like ancestors. When you think of like fight or flight mode, like in the early days when we were stressed, like the only stress we had was like running away from, I don't know, like a tiger or a mammoth or like any animal. So that kind of like caused stress in our body. And so that we were able to run away, the fight or flight response was providing energy quickly. And that's still the case when we do like high intensity training, because our glucose will go up because our body still thinks, well, we need to run away or like do anything like very intense. The good thing though is that even though the glucose levels go up, on the one hand, they will drop immediately at the end of the workout, and they still train our cells. They build muscle mass, they help our heart health. So there are a lot of like benefits to high intensity exercise, even though the glucose may spike, right? So like, as I mentioned earlier, like what's too high, that is not the case for high intensity exercise, because we still need the exercise to yeah, train our cells and help our body to gain muscle mass and maintain a healthy body, like a healthy metabolism. And then another thing that's very important to keep in mind, especially when you're in a perimenopausal phase, is stress and sleep management. Because a lot of you and a lot of the women who are in their perimenopausal years, they may be at the peak life of, on the one hand, their career. They may have either like teenagers or kids at home they're looking after, or maybe even the parents. And so life is a lot of like stressful moments, and there's like so much to juggle. And unfortunately, stress has a negative, quote unquote, negative impact on our glucose levels. As I mentioned during the high intensity exercise, that's one form of stress. Um, so cortisol, as we all know, is like the stress hormone. And I mentioned, if you remember the hierarchy, insulin is one of the bully hormones, and cortisol is as well. So if the cortisol levels are high, the body is not able, quote unquote, to manage or to balance the glucose levels, because like it's in this high stress situation, and continuously releases glucose, and increases the blood sugar levels. So there's like this direct link between stress and cortisol, stress and glucose, which on the one hand was a good thing back in the days, but now the stressful situations are rarely those when we need to be like very active. It's more like an unpleasant meeting, or like yeah, just daily stress. And so if the stress levels are high continuously, the chances are very high that the glucose levels will be higher as well. So monitoring your stress is an important aspect of monitoring your glucose levels as well. We even notice with some of our users that when they are like super stressed and not mindful during their meal time, that their glucose levels are higher than if they really like close the laptop, don't respond to any emails, and then just enjoy the meal. The glucose levels will be lower. So that's super interesting to observe, that even those like small tweaks, such as like again, being mindful or taking a few deep breaths, it will reduce your cortisol and again, then also your glucose levels. And what's also interesting is that the cortisol levels, they have their like own 24-hour rhythm, being the highest in the morning. So that's another, when you monitor your glucose levels, I think it's just fascinating that if you have, for example, a quote unquote regular wake up rhythm, you will notice that your glucose levels drop a little before you wake up because it's your cortisol that will then increase the glucose levels. So if you like have a regular rhythm, like a regular, it's called circadian rhythm, you will notice that the glucose levels drop, and then because of the cortisol, the increase to tell you, okay, it's ready to get up, it's ready to like start the day, and so you get this like little booster of energy. That's something you will also notice right here. It's like it drops and then it goes up. Again, that's just a graph, a visualization, but it holds true for most of us. And unfortunately, also high cortisol levels disrupt sleep and then also the metabolism, which then can also lead again to weight gain. And it can be even higher during the perimenopausal phase. And as I said earlier, like small changes can already have a big impact. And you see here, like one of the, I would say, like easiest change you can make anytime is, for example, when you eat a salad as a starter, or let's say when you eat like fiber-rich products before you eat carb-rich foods. And for me, and on one hand, it's also for me important to mention that Hello Inside, we are not about limiting or like restricting any foods, right? Because we want you to be able to make sustainable habit changes and like have a sustainable, yeah, lifestyle that improves your perimenopausal system. And if you cut out certain foods completely, the chances are high that you will have those at a craving, and then you will eat more of that, and that will actually worsen the whole situation. So it's really about incorporating small things into your life that will benefit your glucose levels, and it will benefit your um, glucose levels and your hormonal levels. So, what are those like 5 simple tips that I can share with you guys that you can implement even without wearing a glucose monitor? Even though I recommend wearing one, just for the sake of curiosity, and because you'll learn so much more when you actually wear a monitor. But those tips, they will stabilize your glucose levels every day. And they are simple. On the one hand, try to avoid or like limit sweetened drinks. Then on the other hand, another tip is fiber first. As I mentioned earlier, if you eat a salad, or also if you just open the fridge and like have a bag of like baby carrots in there, or like celery sticks, they count as fiber as well. They are a great source of fiber. And if you eat those food items while you prep your meal, that will then automatically reduce the glucose increase. And there's the reason is twofold. On the one hand, I want you to imagine your stomach similar to a sink. And so when you eat something, your food gets into the stomach. And once the food reaches the intestines, that's when the glucose increases, right? Because from the intestines, it goes into your blood. But if you eat like fiber first, it kind of like plugs or clogs the what's it called, the drain. So it doesn't drain that well anymore into the intestine. And so the glucose will rise lower and slower because it's like clogged. There's no way that like it just takes some time for the glucose that you eat to really get through this like little clog. And then on the other hand, like if you already eat like fiber first, you will feel fuller, right? Because the food then takes longer, or like your meal time takes a little longer, and the chances are very high that many of us are very quick eaters or like fast eaters. And if you eat slower, it will also help your body to send the signal to your brain, hey, you are actually already full. So you eat less of the meal you would have after, right? Let's say like you eat a salad before a pasta. On the one hand, you clog the stomach, so it's harder for the glucose, the pasta, to drain. And then on the other hand, you feel full earlier because you already had some fiber first. And that also holds kind of like true what I explained about the sink to cover your carbs. Like if the carbs, as I mentioned earlier, are the carbs are those macronutrients that will increase the glucose levels the quickest. So if you cover those carbs, it will be harder for your body to actually access the carbs because they are protected or covered by, for example, protein and fat. And then another trick, as I mentioned earlier, exercise. Any exercise is beneficial for our glucose levels, for our body. And then also, I recommend eating sweets as a dessert and not as a snack in between because we all need sweets. Or I wouldn't say we all, but probably the majority of us needs some kind of sweet sometime during the day or like just during the week. And if, as I said as well, like if you restrict yourself too much on like any of those sweets, you will experience those cravings eventually. And the glucose monitoring will help you understand, on the one hand, which sweets work best for you, and then also which sweets or like when to eat those sweets. Because as a snack in between, as we see, for example, here with like a banana, it will increase your glucose rapidly. But if you, on the one hand, combine it with any like protein or fat, or if you eat them, as I said, like as a dessert, you already have this natural combination, and this will eventually lead to a lower or like a smaller glucose increase. All those tips, they will still change your glucose response, right? The body will still react to that. And we also want to see that our body reacts to the food we eat. But it is a question on how high and how long and how much the glucose will be elevated, because that will then determine whether you have experienced any of the long or short-term consequences of high glucose fluctuations. And last but not least, nutrition is very individual. And I think I mentioned it already that what works for me may not work for you. And I want to encourage you all to find your sweet spot and try it out yourself and explore with like a salad first and then eating the same meal without a salad, or also with like sweets or any exercise. Like try to even like go for a short walk after the next meal you're enjoying, and see how you feel. How does it impact also your energy levels or also your mood? And maybe even how does it impact your sleep tonight? And I really hope that all of those tips and tricks are helpful, because I feel they are like, and I would say they are very easy to implement. And also, it keep in mind, like whatever you do to stabilize your glucose, it will help your hormonal levels as well. Because from now on, nobody knows your body better than you. And as I said, I really hope that all those tips and the information was helpful and valuable for you. And if you want to find out more, check out the top link. And then, unfortunately, we are not available yet in the US, but it's coming soon. So if you want to be like the first to know when Hello Inside is available in the US, I want you to sign up and join our waitlist. And I'm excited to have you all on board, because I am of the very strong opinion that we learn so much by understanding our glucose levels. And I also recommend checking in on a regular basis to see what is going on, because our life and the lifestyle changes, how like in the same way the seasons change, right? So there will be like different food items, or there will be like maybe a different job, or like a different, you have a vacation. So there are like so many moments where your life, you may feel it's the same, but it's not. And the monitoring your glucose levels is a great way to help you understand where in life, or like where you are, and how your lifestyle actually impacts your health and well-being. And that is it from my side. Are there any questions? I don't see anything in the chat. Also, I hope my English didn't have too much accent. I tried to, but sometimes it's a little tricky, especially when switching between German and English all the time. But I hope you understand everything. Cool. Well then, I wish you all a wonderful Thursday and take care. Bye bye.